All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Slashcast. We're doing a little bit of a relaunch. We've got some new equipment, but today we are going to be talking about fascism in America in
Yay!
2025. So,
Woo-hoo.
nice, fun topic to dig into. The reason we're talking about it today is because we have a book, which Eric will lift up right now, that we have published, and this is available on Amazon if you'd like to read it. It's pretty,
Bye now. Bye now.
yeah, bye now. So we've done a few items on this topic, but this will be kind of our closing sally, and then we will be moving on to other topics. Thanks everyone for the feedback. It's been very positive. Lots of people encouraging us to do more. Do the whole like and subscribe, give us feedback, and hope you enjoy the new setup. And let's go ahead and kick off with Eric.
Yes.
You
And I've read the agenda. I know what's coming. I do know it's coming.
Hey, don't, no peek behind the curtains. Okay, so this book came from a discussion that you initiated. Why don't you talk a little bit
Yes,
about that?
yes. Well, actually, it mostly came from trolls. So I was just getting frustrated on social media because what I was finding is that in the comments to any post or whatever, both sides were calling each other fascists. So the right side was calling the left fascist and the left was calling the right fascist. And it was annoying because then it's a meaningful word, but it was losing all meaning because no one was really clearly defining it one way or the other. And so being an ex-political science student, I thought I really should know what the definition is. And I didn't. I couldn't write down in one paragraph what fascism is. So I said, okay, that's interesting. So I then went to the shelves and I started reading various authors on the subject. There's there's a few modern and a few old ones. Jason Stanley is pretty good. Roger Griffin, Robert Paxton, and Umberto Eco is one of the older ones. And really, these were the only guys that were putting forward to what I considered a meaningful definition of what fascism is. And the interesting thing is it took them each a whole book to do that, right? Because as it turns out, to define fascism is really, really hard. And but each of them basically came up, in their own ways with saying that fascism can be defined by a bunch of characteristics or dimensions, things that are happening all at once, and you sort of need them all to occur at once. And when I compared them all, I did a spreadsheet and I sort of compared them all. I realized that they really all were talking about the same set of dimensions, just with slightly different verbiage. And so the first thing I did was to take that spreadsheet and then rationalize it. And I was able to generate a set of 12 dimensions that define a fascist state. So it's like just a checkbox exercise. If you can check all 12 things, then it is a fascist state. And so
Welcome to fascism.
yay. And so that would at least provide a baseline. Now, either side could disagree with those 12 dimensions. So in this model, you can actually add, modify, or remove dimensions in that checklist, right? So we want to make this a usable framework that anybody, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, but so long as you're using a clear definition, then we can understand what each other are talking about. And so the first step was to come up with these 12. So I did that. And then the next question really was, well, where do we stand? Where do we stand? And I didn't want, I wanted to come up with something that was, not nonpartisan and defensible. So I said, what if we just collect evidence or counter evidence to say like the current regime is or is not demonstrating this particular, dimension 1 through 12. And so I set up a daily ChatGPT query. And the idea was to run this query every day for 3 months. And I asked it essentially for each of these dimensions, just go out and scour the internet for any news that provides evidence one way or the other to any of these 12 dimensions. And then I had this spreadsheet that I was posting online, which just simply every day collected what ChatGPT had identified as either evidence of or evidence against fascism in America. By the end of that 3 months, came up with some really, really, really interesting things. One is that actually, according to our 12 dimensions, the US actually is in early stage fascism, and in some ways trending towards kind of a full-blown fascist state already, which was kind of scary.
Spoiler alert, spoiler
Yeah,
alert.
spoiler alert. Yeah. And at that point, then you came in, Dave came in, and we decided to do more than just a social media post and a spreadsheet online, and like put some actual academic rigor behind the study, really challenge the 12 dimensions, improve them. The dimensions did change. And then last but not least is it was kind of depressing. Like, it's depressing to come up with the dimensions and then map them against evidence and find, oh, we're kind of actually moving towards fascism. And so we said, as we go through and talk about each of these dimensions, let's not just say not just diagnose, are you fascist or not, but say, well, what if you decide that you don't like fascism, what can you do as a person with no money, no time, no influence, no fame? What can a normal person do to actually make a difference to whether we continue to move towards or not? And so each chapter is essentially a discussion of the dimension, the evidence put forward, and a set of things that any of us can easily do to make a difference in this world moving away from fascism. There is an interesting point here, which is that we do as authors make a case that fascism is bad, right?
Yeah,
So
let's get
that's
into that a little bit later, because
okay. Okay.
I think we can challenge the assumptions, but our idea really was, I mean, working together, initiating is, okay, well, let's do this relatively scientifically. So state our assumptions, right? Produce a hypothesis, test that hypothesis with evidence, and then the follow-up actions are kind of, they connect to that. So I think for a general audience, they might have some assumptions on where we're coming from and some different assumptions about what a good system of political governance is that we can kind of delve into. I think that those parts are really interesting. So we're really looking at, oh, well, if we're assuming that an American constitutional democracy with free market capitalism is the goal, then this is what follows, right? Those assumptions can be questioned, and I think we'll question those pretty soon. And like you said, this is, this is an initial experiment, setting out the assumptions. The assumptions can be challenged. Setting out the framework and definition, those can be challenged. Putting forth the evidence and counter evidence, those can be challenged. So we're really looking forward to as much peer review as we can to really make this what it can be. And it's not coming from a right or left perspective, particularly as classically defined, and certainly not Democrat versus Republican, because the assumption is, the American system is a counter-fascist system in and of itself, and then we can kind of debate how far removed we are from those ideals. But like you said, the traditional American values, as set out in the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, those are assumptions, but they're not givens, right? So there are other ways to organize governments that have had more or less degrees of success. But by doing that, we're saying, okay, well, both parties have explicitly said we're pro-constitution, we're pro-democracy, all these other things. So once you say that, we can build those as assumptions that are agreed. So then deviation from those values is really what we're tracking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And and just to add on, right, there is a wonderful discussion to be had against liberalism with a capital L and neoliberalism, and whether or not, that's the best, whether or not modern capitalist plus democracy is the best approach to government. That's not really the point of the book, right? So we want to hold that a little bit out right now. Let's just focus just on fascism and being able to agree on a definition of how you define fascism. And once you have that agreement, then simply how do you gather evidence one way or the other to just decide. And we're not, we're actually the framework doesn't put any value judgment on it. It doesn't say whether it's good to have
That's a
fascism
really
as the
good point.
outcome or not. It doesn't
Yep.
care. It's just a definitional framework. Once you have decided where you are on that spectrum, then you move out of the book and you have the discussion that we might that we're having today, which is like, so what? Now that we know where we are on the fascism scale, what do we do with that information?
Yeah, I think I brought it up to you snarkily. We could have written this from the viewpoint of how do you promote fascism?
Sure. Absolutely. In fact, the 12 dimensions provide a really good framework for
Yeah.
somebody that, yeah,
How is fascism doing and how can we get more of it? Right.
that's
So,
right.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's just, as you say, it's an assessment. How fascist is this stuff that's going on? And it's more or less objective. And I think theoretically, and we'll get into that in just a minute, but folks might be surprised on where we are on the political spectrum in terms of traditional Democrat, Republican, left, right, all that kind of stuff. But let's get into next a couple of things that have come up since we published, which are kind of interesting and inform the discussion around the book itself. And how does that fit in? One of the things that it got a lot of news in Denmark and Europe more broadly. I'm in Denmark, just for those who don't know, is the National Security Strategy document. Now, I don't know how much you got into that. It's the basic idea is relevant to this discussion and to Europe in particular is the US government, the national security advisors, all those folks, they got together. This is a typical process that occurs within a presidency, but this was a little different being Trump. And they produced a document that essentially said Europe is undergoing civilizational collapse and that the US government has a duty to promote right-wing populist governments and parties in order to prevent I believe they used the term civilizational erasure of Europe. And mm, suffice it to say, Europeans found that alarming. Um, I think these are beyond dog whistles. This is essentially white nationalism that they're talking about. They're not talking about civilizational erasure based on specific policies or values. They're talking about immigration, bringing in non-white people, and that being the downfall of civilization as we know it. So very alarming. And I'm not sure how Europe is going to respond.
How much does wokeism, i- uh, uh, matter in that framework, right? Is it just immigration and the erasure of culture, but because it's kind of getting dulled out, or is there woke? What are the other aspects of that?
Yeah, so this would be a good time to talk about some of the issues brought up are real issues, and it's fair, but approaching those from kind of a white Christian nationalist perspective is probably not the most productive solution. So if you're talking about wokeism, so one of the other parts of the national security document refers to free speech, right? And to my ears and to a lot of the European viewpoint, I mean, it's hypocritical. Obviously, you're talking about MAGA promoting free speech while trying to get Jimmy Kimmel off the air, trying to shut down journalists, trying to do all these other things, impeding free speech. But so when they're talking about that issue, they're talking about, for example, in England, in the UK, people who have been prosecuted or brought into civil liability in various ways for social media posts. And I take a bit of a libertarian view on that, which is unless you're actively promoting violence, I think your social media posts should be pretty hands off. But there also subsequent there have been subsequent actions where the State Department is sanctioning specific European organizations that are trying to combat active disinformation. So, Russian troll farms influencing elections, undermining informational integrity, that kind of thing. And so the US State Department is actively sanctioning those groups. And so it's really tricky, especially in the European context. So wokeism is not really a European thing, that's much more of an American thing. But there are some concerning signs, such as the British government saying that I think the Palestinian Action, a specific organization, was defined as a hate group. So there are all these old ladies coming out to protest and aligning themselves with that group, and they're being arrested. It's a bad look. I think that that's probably a fair target for criticism in terms of free speech. But in general, you've got anti-free speech people promoting their particular ideas of free speech, and that's on both ends of the spectrum. And then you have active disinformation campaigns, including by foreign actors, spreading through social media, and that's a dangerous thing. And that's tricky, right? To kind of differentiate those two factors from each other.
So I probably, in the introduction, I probably should have gone through the 12 dimensions, right? Because what we want to do here is like look at the national security strategy and ask, is it driving more fascism or less fascism? And then you use the 12 dimensions to do that. So this is actually a really good, because this isn't in the book, because this happened after the book. So this is a good demonstration of how you would actually use the book in practice. So let me just quickly go through the 12 dimensions so that I can, if you haven't read the book, but of course you should buy the book.
Uh, I did read the book.
Yeah, you read the book. I was talking about the three people that are listening.
Hey, people.
So, sorry. So the first dimension is nationalism as identity, meaning that we define who we are by the nation state and the history of, and particularly in the history of the nation state. We're trying to go back to a beautiful time when everything was great, and that represented our national identity. And as part of that, it also means that you exclude everybody that's not part of that ideal, right? So that's the first one. The second one is enemy obsession. So if we're going to rally around each other, we need an enemy to rally against. So having an enemy is critical to fascist states. Next one is sort of a military valorization. So we have parades and we are actually excited about war and the military. The fourth one is we don't allow dissent. So we stop channels of dissent. Fifth one is control of the media and kind of the use of the media for state propaganda around nationalism as identity and enemy obsession, military values, etc. Then the sixth one is leader cult. So you need a charismatic leader who is going to represent the movement and that we can all sort of follow. The next one is really thought control. It's defining what our culture is, what we believe in, and making sure that everything kind of all of society lines up to that. Next is corporatism. So the state merges with capitalism. And as part of that, you're going to have labor control or labor suppression. The next one is judiciary capture. So you need to make sure that the judiciary doesn't get in the way of the executive. In fact, you also need legislative capture as well, so that the executive basically removes the tripart system. Then there's sort of anti-elite populism, as we know today, and of course, putting ourselves in a state of permanent crisis. So those are the 12 dimensions, if you will. So as I was listening to you, I was kind of like checking off. So the security strategy. So obviously nationalism as identity is immediately tied to anything having to do with immigration policy and sort of defining the white Christian nationalism, as you would say, is defining what is good. Enemy obsession falls nicely into that. I didn't really see a lot of military valorization in that so far, but that could be there. The lack of dissent is critical. So this is building up a state policy. So this is a security policy, if you will. This is a strategy. So this is saying that this is making it possible to disagree with that when we implement foreign policy. I didn't see much media control there. Leader cult, no. Thought control, yes. Corporatism, no. Labor control, no.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, no specific piece of evidence is going to apply across the
No,
board,
no,
but
no. Yeah,
yeah,
the evidence. So the evidence typically actually mostly falls into one category. Every now and then you'll get evidence that does cross
a
into
lot of it
two or
falls
more,
into two or three, but yeah,
but you will never have one evidence that does everything. So,
right.
but you still want to
Unless
go
it's
down the
Project
list.
2025.
There you go. um, so,
Bases.
but you want to basically go down the list and ask yourself for any particular thing that's happening now, what does it support any of these dimensions, or does it act as a counterbalance against any of these forces? So cool. So that definitely falls into the fascist dimensions.
Yeah, and I mean, let's see what feedback we get, because we've discussed whether we put this onto the web as some form of living document that people can collaboratively, as things develop, as it were. And as more evidence comes in, more counter evidence, refine everything from the definition to the progress on each dimension in terms of fascism. So a couple of other things I just wanted to hit real quick, and I've got some hard discussion points after that. So obviously the activity of the administration towards Venezuela.
Man,
So we had not just additional so-called drug boats attacked with missiles, killing people where there's no evidence, obviously no due process in any way. But we had the double tap where there were survivors from the
yes.
initial hit, and the folks under Hegseth or with Hegseth decided, well, let's just kill them. So then that aligns with the buildup of what Trump called the greatest armada in history of military force in the sea around or near Venezuela. And, on the one hand, with the drug boats, it's justified by a confidential Justice Department legal document, which says that, yes, this is all totally legal, but we won't tell you why. And then, there are kind of two approaches. One is this is all illegal. It doesn't follow the War Powers Act. These are civilians. These are not warriors, right? They are committing drug crimes if they are, which means they deserve due process. You can't just kill people extrajudicial on suspicion. So that's kind of one tack. And the other tack is, okay, let's say, for the sake of, discussion, that these are armed, opponents in an actual conflict, then it's still probably a war crime to kill them when they're just kind of floating in the ocean.
It's definitely a war crime. If they're, yeah, that one is definitely, come on. But I think to be fair, I think I think that what the Trump administration would say is that it's not a war. These are terrorists, so they don't fall under the War Powers Act. This is under internal Homeland Security.
Right. But I mean, this, I don't know if we how deeply we want to delve into this, but the looseness of the ability of administrations to kill people based on understanding that they're terrorists without evidence. I mean, this happened under Obama. He killed tons of
A
people with
lot,
drones,
yes,
right?
yes.
Also, whether you can classify drug runners as terrorists, because that's a really loose definition of terrorism, right? I mean, there are terrorist activities that cartels undertake, but that's primarily, for example, within Mexico. The cartels there will use terror to intimidate police and government officials, but it's extremely difficult to argue that those organizations are acting as terrorists against the United States. So it's a very tricky and broad definition. of what terrorism means, and it definitely should be more transparent. Congress and the judiciary should be involved in allowing for that to be more fully defined and agreed. Then there's just the broader question of, okay, well, why Venezuela?
Yeah, really. Well,
And,
oil.
well, okay, so Trump came out and said, they took our land, they took our oil, and we want it back. And they kind of started skirting around that issue, and then they said, well, you know, Maduro heads a cartel, the Cartel del Sol, or del Soles, I forget, but that is running drugs into America. And there's evidence that the Maduro government is very corrupt and involved in criminal activity. But in terms of being organized as a cartel, that's very shaky. And they definitely are not running fentanyl into the US. They are a conduit for some cocaine smuggling, but then again, so is Colombia, Honduras, and Trump went ahead and pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was actually convicted in an American court of drug smuggling, and decided that that was okay, but Venezuela needed to be targeted as narco terrorists. So there's obvious hypocrisy and internal contradictions here that are pretty easily resolved when you get Trump saying the quiet part out loud, which is, we want the oil,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And if you look at Trump's foreign policy in general, oil is kind of an outsized influence on his thinking in terms of cozying up to Middle Eastern states, having less concern about Ukraine, going after Venezuela explicitly. Obviously, his anti climate rhetoric, his absolute hatred of windmills for whatever reason, that's really sticking up his craw. I mean, those are all quite interesting.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna. I wanted to move us away from Trump bashing and kind of back to the question about fascism. And I think that, to me, what's interesting is, as we move. So we also define in the first chapter that fascism isn't a one-off. You suddenly move. You're suddenly fascist, or you're certainly not fascist, and then you are fascist. It's actually a phased. It grows over time. So it's important to make a distinction between latent fascism, which is maybe what Obama administration and the Clinton administration are setting us up for, and then early fascism, which is what Trump's first term was all about, and then moving into full-blown fascism, which is what is potential for the next 4 or 5 years. That's an important distinction. And one of the things that makes the difference between early fascism, which to me is like it's more than latent, it's potential. It's a active movement towards. The difference between that and full blown fascism is that in full blown fascism, all of these dimensions actually get built into the infrastructure, into the laws, into the policies, into the structure of government. So they're institutionalized. And I think that with regard to the Venezuela's thing, the worry is homeland security, right, and all of the legal infrastructure around that, and the fact that the Trump administration was able to classify drug dealers as terrorists, which to me is a joke. That's not at all the intention of definition of terrorism in homeland security. We're already using something not the way it's intended to. So now we're capturing. Now Trump is going to be able to expand and increase the power of that institution, the Homeland Security institution, to make it way more powerful than it was supposed to be. And to institutionalize, I can see that ICE becomes a Homeland Security issue. And suddenly migrants are terrorists. They're no longer illegal immigrants. They're terrorists now.
Yeah, and
And
they
then,
are being called that,
and
right?
once you do that, calling them that is one thing. But then when you start bombing and using military force and the powers of the state, that's where you get into full blown fascism, because now the state is actually empowered legally and morally and everything else to go do that. And so what's interesting is again is it it isn't that somehow Trump changed everything. That there's 100-year history, or maybe less, a 60-year history of latent fascism, and the way that the U.S. has been moving towards the point where a fascist could actually come in and take over.
Yeah, so there's a couple of interesting things to touch on there, including, ICE being built into kind of a paramilitary force under direct executive control that can act with impunity and lack of transparency anywhere on US soil. Also, the fact that in terms of immigration, you start with the idea that these are criminal, illegal immigrants, right? And then you have just illegal immigrants. Then you have people who entered the country illegally but have legal status, right? Those are having their legal status removed to become illegal immigrants, right? And then you have legal immigrants on visas who, let's say, participate in a pro-Palestinian protest and their
Right.
legal status is revoked. Then you have ending birthright citizenship, which is stripping away citizenship from actual Americans who were born in America. So it's narrowing and narrowing the definition of what an American is more and more to where you get to kind of the blood and soil and the
Yes.
white Christian nationalism. And that's where, you were talking about some of the seeds of fascism going back decades and decades and decades. And you can kind of go through slavery, the KKK, the John Birch Society, the McCarthyism. There are this push and pull with white Christian nationalism as a thread through American history and back and forth. And so there are a lot of dimensions that this is working on. But what I want to get into a little bit is immigration is tricky. And, obviously, as I just kind of went through, immigration is being defined more and more narrowly by the Trump administration. But in Europe, it's a different situation. So you talked about the nation state and nationalism. One of the unique attributes of the American experiment is that in theory and to a degree in practice, it was not a nation state in the terms of an ethno nationalist, even linguistic state. So it's set out in the Constitution and is set out by immigration patterns. We'll bypass the whole genocide issue of the Native Americans for now, but it was not created as the European states were, for example, as that era of nation state building, where you're looking at people with common ethnic, linguistic, and even religious backgrounds forming a nation and their borders. America was not that by the intention of the founders. So it's a very different situation than it is in Europe. And one of the ironies of that is for all the pushback on immigration in the US, immigration has been one of the greatest strengths of the US economically, socially, and the integration of immigrants in the US has been much more successful by a lot of measures than it has been in Europe. So I think, there's the straw man argument about open borders and the failure of the Biden administration to enforce border control. I think you and I would agree that immigration control is necessary, right? Because you have borders, you need border control, you need to manage and define your immigration policy, right? And the reason that it failed in the US is because Congress just did not act. They refused to legislate immigration reform. And so then it became a real problem under Biden and a cudgel under Trump. But the situation in Europe is quite different in that immigration rates are, well, lower in some ways than in the US, but also European states are, in some terms, ethno-national states, right? So there is part of I'm in Denmark, and there are ethnic Danes in terms of the historical makeup of this piece of land, right? And on the one hand, you can say, well, what does that mean to be Danish? And for some folks that are anti-immigration, they would think that if you are not ethnically Danish, you cannot be Danish, and then there is no such thing as integration. But on the other hand, there is a huge demographic cliff coming for all of Europe and other places as well. And I would argue that integrating immigrants into these societies in Europe is really the only way to maintain the economy, the social welfare system, etc. And that does mean broadening the national identity beyond specific ethnic groups, which gets a lot of pushback. So that's kind of the difference in the European situation as opposed to the American situation to a degree. And
Interesting.
again, the integration of immigrants into Europe is largely less successful than that in the US. And that causes actual issues that need to be addressed. You know, you have Muslim enclaves where there is less assimilation than you might normally have from immigrant populations. And there is some defense of that from Europeans that you might call wokeists, but it does call into question. Let's say we put the ethnic part aside. What do you think can be expected in terms of defining national values according to, let's say, liberal democratic purposes and enforcing assimilation to those values, for example, with populations of Muslims who share very conservative Muslim religious viewpoints?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, right? And I think I'm simultaneously on both sides of the fence here. So on the one hand, me personally, I don't care about borders. To me, we are just one humanity. We are just one Earth, one planet. Borders are stupid, frankly. But I also understand. I understand the position of the other side, right? I mean, like I get, like, hey, we have this land, we've bought it, we've paid for it, we have a society that we want to live in, and we don't want that to be challenged, and we're proud of it. I can understand that, so I can understand the resistance to it. But you know, it's so one of the ironies, of course, about immigration is that the Mexican ethnic group lived in the States longer than the Caucasian ethnic group, right? So, like,
Yeah.
and you know, I had a very obnoxious thought when you were talking about the Danes, and I was thinking, aren't they just all Germans? Um, sorry, but I mean, like, and then the Palestinians in Israel, right? I mean, like, they had homes there for a shit long time, right? And you know, and they had their land essentially stolen by the Europeans to create the state of Israel. Um,
Yeah,
so
I do want to stay away from, I specifically wanted to deal with Europe and with America because the imposition of borders across nation states by Europe and America via colonialism, I mean,
mm,
that's just a whole can
yeah,
of worms that
yeah,
I yeah, the arbitrary drawing of borders across, you know, ethno nationalist lines in the Middle East
yeah.
alone is a
But
full podcast.
I guess what I wanted to say is that personally, I don't see any value in borders. I don't care if people move freely across the world. I think that's fine. I think having more diversity is a great challenge, and it's social. You know, it's you know, I don't want to say social Darwinism or social evolution because there are lots of problems with that area of thinking. But I just think it's just part of life. It's part of nature, and I don't get it. But I appreciate like how scary that is. So I don't
Well,
feel like the other side are evil.
Yeah, I mean, okay, this is putting me in a very strange position. I see it less of a moral and more of a practical issue of managing your population, right? So, in terms of if you have a state and a government, and let's just take having a census, having social welfare, having healthcare, right? You need to actually know who is in your country and who is not. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So you cannot manage a country if people just are sometimes there, sometimes not there.
Well, I don't think that's what immigrants are. I don't think immigrants are
No,
going back and forth.
okay, but if you're talking about just not having borders, right? On a very basic level, borders define who is in your country and who is not in your country, right?
I guess. Yeah. Assuming that there is this thing called country. I mean, we're
Okay,
getting very far away from the book, by the way, but
we're
it's
getting
still
very far away
interesting.
from
Still
everything.
interesting.
So, but okay, let's. I don't. I mean, your hippie take that borders are just artificial lines on a map, dude,
Yes.
and everyone should just do whatever they want and go wherever they want.
Yes.
I don't think that's a pragmatic short-term discussion to have on this subject as it pertains to actually running governments, right? I think aspirationally that sounds okay, but if you take Denmark and everyone has to
I mean, I
have
think.
a
Listen,
health
wait, wait.
card,
So
right?
I'm with you. I'm with you on practicality, but I would state that practicality came from the fact that we had a mental model of countries. And the reason that we're in this situation where the reality of the world and of technology and of everything doesn't care about borders is crashing against the mental model of we have countries with borders, and those countries have been the institutions and the structures and the systems that define those countries have they're defining it in the way that makes it impossible to define it in the way that it truly is. So, but I'm okay with your argument that let's talk about being practical. So from now on, I'm going to throw away the hippie stuff and let's just talk about practicality because that's a fair
Yeah, I
discussion.
mean, your point is really interesting in terms of are we reaching the end of the era of nation states themselves, and I think that is a discussion that we can have. But just as an example, Denmark has social welfare, universal health care. So, on an edge case, what we could look at is okay, let's say Russia actually wins in Ukraine, and suddenly there are millions of Ukrainians in Denmark, right? Without healthcare, not part of the social system, no place to live, anything like that, right? If you had a borderless society or something similar to that, it would be extremely disruptive, impractical, tough to manage. It would be it would be a problem. Um, and that's an extreme case. And so I think from the the folks that are concerned about immigration from that perspective, they are getting overblown, overhyped fear mongering about immigration overall. But it comes from the baseline that immigration policy has been in Europe and America not very strategically thought out, not very consistently executed, right? And not very practically implemented in terms of, well, who should be allowed to immigrate into a country for family reasons, economic reasons, and so forth, and how is that managed? And it's a very difficult subject, and I think it's made more difficult by the folks on the left who take a bit of a wokest no borders attitude, and the folks on the right who conflate having a coherent immigration policy with just not wanting brown people or Muslims in their country, and either not admitting it or the government trying to manage it without admitting that it's a concern to a large percent of the population. So it becomes very, very difficult to manage when you're not honest about what you're trying to achieve and implementing a policy that achieves that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more willing to have discussions about the efficiency of bureaucratic management when you have a very fast influx of people who are different, and they don't understand the culture, the current culture, versus nationalism, identity, and enemy obsession, which is the fascist take on immigration, right? Which is that it's not about efficient management. Because I would almost say, like, if I take a step back and let's remove all the ideas of, like, we don't want brown people or Muslims, right? If we remove that, we just say, let's look at how immigration has worked in the U.S. across time. There have been periods where it wasn't so good, and there's been periods where it's good, but in general, pretty freaking good. Like,
Well,
you
yeah.
know, like we have done very well as a result of immigration policies throughout the history of the U.S. So I hear what you're saying, and I wonder if it's just that it's a moment in time. There's heavy disruption caused by globalization, and that disruption has caused migrant flows that are just unusual, and that
Yep.
puts a lot of pressure on the
Yep.
systems which are built for the normal time, when you know 10% is this, and 70% is here, and then 30% is that, and we just allow it to basically flow, and you know do the right thing, in at the end, right? But it's more about the historical context. Right now, we're in a moment of disruption, I would say, caused by globalization, which has affected war, economics, and all the rest.
Well, and the ease of travel, right?
Yeah.
So you had previous historical examples, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US, where they were concerned about so many Chinese people coming to build railroads and then staying and things like that, that were explicitly racist. But the current situation, or actually more accurately, of a few years ago, in terms of the Syrian civil war, Venezuela did generate a lot of
Yep.
immigrants because people were fleeing the country, and other places like that. But you have the ability to actually transport folks, or for folks to transport themselves across greater distances and greater numbers than previous generations. So there are historical specific situations that apply. And the systems, will take the US, the asylum system in the US is just fully broken, right?
Yeah. I, I
So
guess
folks, yeah,
I guess what I want to say, it's coming to me through the discussion. So discussion is good. It's that I don't think there's anything really broken with the immigration system. I think it's not a very good one, but it's fine. It works. It's worked over time. It's gone up and down. What we have to be focused on is changing the circumstances that are causing the spikes in migration. If we want to talk about American, self-interest, it's much more. I think you'd get far more bang for the buck Marshall planning Latin America than sending troops to Europe or to Middle East or wherever else. Like, if they want to solve the immigration problem, solve the
the
solve
root
the
causes.
problems, the root causes. Don't just close off. In fact, closing off is, you're just making everything worse. I mean, like, we have, right, because of imperialist 1950s to 1990s, we probably caused most of the root causes that are generating some migration now. Like, we destroyed all the democratic movements in Latin America. We set up the drug lords. We
Yeah.
screwed up those countries so bad. So it's our fault in the first place,
Yeah, let's move off immigration, because I think that topic is just too large to cover in this context right now.
I
But
think.
one thing I am really curious about is, obviously, for Trump's second term, Project 2025 was developed as a blueprint, and it was implemented very intentionally at an accelerated pace, partly because what is coming next is the midterms. And beyond that, we're looking at a time when Trump will be out of power one way or another, eventually.
Well,
Okay.
okay, eventually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
One thing
so
I'm really curious about is what happens with the midterms. How transparent is that election going to be? Traditionally, the party in opposition will gain seats, and in this case, that would mean the Democrats would take over the House. They'd be able to launch investigations, tie up legislation, etc. And then more broadly, what is the reaction from Trump to that and the administration? And what do you think 2028 looks like?
Well, I'm probably on the I'm probably on the extreme. So let's state that up front is that I know that my particular view is probably in the extreme. I think the Republicans will do great in the midterms because that they'll make sure that that happens. At this point, the Project 2025 people they've won. They're just this is the last mile here, and and now is the time when they're going to go all out to get it. Because if they can win the midterms and then Trump comes in some form in 2028, whether he comes in formally as president or whether there's any number of different ways that he can remain in power without without breaking any specific amendment. I think it's done. It's going to happen. It's over.
All right, well, let's take those one at a time because it, elections are administered constitutionally by the states. And so, how,
Well,
his, yeah, go ahead.
the in the if he has the right um, party infrastructure in the swing states, he can just say we're gonna the slate of electors is has been is
Sorry. Let's get to the
treasonous.
midterms because it's not the midterms specifically
Mm,
first, right? So that's not slates of electors. Those are representatives and senators elected state by state,
yeah.
right?
But at the state level, those controlled by MAGA can say whatever the hell they want to get the results that they want from those elections.
I do think the election administration infrastructure is a bit more resilient than that. So, are you
I
really
think
saying
I
that
think
in
in
Texas there will be zero Democratic representatives because they will just who will decide it's not allowed to happen?
yeah, I think if you have the governor and the legislature, state legislature together, then they can do whatever they want in terms of um, you know saying that they're going to throw the election results out because there was some kind of problem in the system. I mean, they'll
All
make
right,
up all sorts of stuff.
so that's a separate issue. So this is why I am a little more optimistic than you are, I think. So, for example, I don't believe most conspiracies simply because people are not that organized, right? I do think that if you look at Project 2025 and you look at uh, corporatist influence and power, just give me a sec,
Yeah,
corporatist influence and power over generations, that there is a plan. It's been steadily executed. This is coordinated. However, I think that if you're looking at a political level, state by state, I do not think the infrastructure exists to a um, undermine election integrity in enough states for it to just deliver the outcome that they desire, or
well,
B, to
they just
just
have to
deny
stop.
the elections.
They just have to stop. They already won all three, so it's not like they just have to stop the Democrats from getting a majority in either of the houses. That's not a lot of manipulation to do. That it'll probably come down to two or three states maybe. And I think that if they're the right, I think they will be the right states for the Project 2025 people. And I think that I don't think that there's a conspiracy, but I think everybody has their marching orders and they're very clear on what the outcomes need to be. And they'll all find their own ways within the state rules, state constitutions to make that happen. And if there's and if then there is a upset reaction from the people of those states, Trump will come in and bring in the National Guard, and we have yet another opportunity for um, escalation of violence. so far it's been good. Like they've tried to provoke violence back so that they can then,
Yep. And it's been
kind of
very
go into
limited. Yeah.
military. Yeah, it's been amazing. But this will be just another chance.
So I guess this is, I had this discussion with someone recently where they called into question the election integrity of the election of Trump. So there are conspiracy theorists, I would say, on the left who said that Trump actually stole the last presidential election. And I got into the details of those claims, and the facts did not support them. So there are these folks that basically said, oh, if you look at the voting pattern statistically, then it looks wonky because more votes for Trump came in later in the day or whatever. And it was easy to mathematically disprove and that. So I think it's dangerous on both sides to just not believe that elections still maintain their integrity.
Yeah.
But you currently believe that the midterm elections will be not credible in terms of their results. Okay. I just don't see the mechanism by which that would
By
occur.
which that would occur. I would have to go state by state and role play, scenarios on, because each state is going to be a different, and we don't know what those states are going to be yet too. So we have to get closer to find out.
And
But
that's,
whatever the case is,
yeah.
like this is the worst case scenario, right? So hopefully it's not there, and we step back from that, and we get, the maybe both houses switch hands in the midterms, and then you can have a discussion about then what do you do? I don't know. I'm also negative about that because I think I don't see the social Democrats making enough gains. It'll be
Democratic socialists, you mean?
the Democratic Socialists. I just think it'll be the neoliberals, and it doesn't matter if they get seats. They're going to do bad for the country.
Okay,
I
well,
don't know.
yeah. So I do think my position would be that, as you kind of stated, state by state, you would have to have different mechanisms to undermine the election at that level. And I don't believe the infrastructure is there to make that happen. There might be in isolated cases, but I mean, obviously Trump tried to overturn the election that he lost, and he called Georgia, for example, to try to get extra votes. It's just not that easy to do.
I agree, but I think they had 8 years from then to make it easy to do, and they've been working the angles
I absolutely
hard.
believe that, secretaries of state who are loyalists have been put in place in certain locations. So I think it's scary. I think there will probably be some irregularities that need to be ironed out, and that's a real loss for democracy as a whole. So if that occurs, and if there are legal challenges and contests around a ton of elections, I actually think that that's a more likely outcome, which is that, there are enough individual actors, secretaries of state in purple states with, you know, mixed Republican and Democrat populations, but control of the legislature by Republicans, for example, that individual elections can be messed with and contested, and there will be so much legal rigmarole going back and forth that it's just going to undermine the entire electoral process.
Exactly. So let's say you have, head of governor of Texas, and let's say that we have too many Democrats that are publicly elected. Then he's going to say there was election tampering, things are wrong. I will use my executive powers to say that the Republicans are going to go to Congress, and then we can fight out the results of the election in court. And then it all goes to court, and then Trump wins because that's going to be forever. It'll just go around and around in circles, and then it'll take so long that 2 years will have passed by and the Republicans would have had those legislators in Congress.
Yeah. So again, so far, quite effective strategy of just going beyond the bounds of the law so quickly that it takes longer for the judicial system to catch up than for the execution of those,
Yeah.
policies and crimes. Okay, well, that's depressing as hell. Okay, so let's game plan those two scenarios out a couple years, right? So one is Republicans or MAGA Republicans through whatever nefarious means or legitimately
Well, yeah, it could be
maintain.
legitimate too.
Sure.
The MAGA people that I speak with are not at all bothered by anything that the Democrats are bothered by. Like, they don't care about Epstein. They don't care about Ukraine.
Wait, the
They just
MAGA
don't
people don't
care
care about
anymore.
Epstein?
The MAGA people that I talk to don't care about whether Trump is Epstein or not. They want to vote for
Right.
Trump.
Yeah. They care about, okay, so I mean, the MAGAsphere generally cares about the Epstein case,
Yeah.
but not necessarily whether Trump is guilty in the Epstein case.
Or even if he were, whether he should be, he's still okay. We still vote for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes more sense.
He's okay because God told him to molest children.
Yeah. No, let's Trump is God's warrior. We went into that a little bit in the book. Let's step aside from that. So let's game plan out a couple of this real quick. So in the scenario that the Republicans maintain power across all three branches, right? What does that look like for the next 3 years and then after? And in the scenario where Democrats at least get control of the House and start to launch investigations and disrupt the legislative goals of Trump.
To me, it's the end result is a win for Trump in 2028, because if they don't win in the midterms, then the MAGA continues, or I should say, Project 2025 continues to execute their plan and have absolute control over the 2028 elections. At that point, Trump, if the Democrats don't come back in midterms, then Trump will win in 2028. And then if they do, and they go in and they just their approach is, let's throw things into the machine. Let's raise investigations. Let's be a gnat flying around there. That looks bad. That looks stupid. I don't even like that. Like, what the hell? Like, this is so weak. You're going to continue to be this annoying mosquito, and they're going to stop the government from doing anything. So day to day, everybody hurts. So you're going to get 2 years of more economic woes. You're going to have unclear. Well, I mean, Trump is going to still execute his war policy anyways, and they're just going to complain about it, and then try to get him sanctioned. But who cares? It won't do anything. So it's almost better to me if they don't win the midterms, because unless the Democratic Socialists were to actually meaningfully get into power and really do extreme things, if it's just the neoliberals that are in there, Chuck Schumer and all these guys, they're not going to do shit. They're just going to talk.
Well, I think they would definitely open investigations.
Yeah, oh, sure. Open investigations. Who cares? We already know that doesn't work with Trump. Opening investigations we have evidence, ample evidence that that's not a useful approach with Trump.
Okay, so let's leave that part there. So you think either scenario is a bad outcome just based on what the options are. But I'm not sure how much I agree with that, but let's look forward. There are already fractures appearing within the MAGA movement.
Yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene and that kind of stuff.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you had the Turning Point convention where Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro were sniping at each other. You have J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio kind of positioning themselves as Trump successors. So things, we mentioned in the book, but one of the issues with authoritarian and fascist governments is what happens after dear leader is not there. This is a very messy succession,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Situation. And what do you anticipate? I mean, okay, let's say 2028, whether Trump is not immortal,
yeah,
regardless. Okay,
yeah,
so whether Trump is trying to run himself or whether he is trying to be a puppet master behind the scenes, or even whether he tries to run as vice president, have someone else,
yeah,
resign and hand it to him. At
yeah.
some point, there will be a succession issue, right?
I think there already is. I think there already is. Um, I think that they need right now. They are at this point of fascism, which is where Nazis got to, where the Italians, Mussolini guys got to, where it's still cult of the leader, but they haven't institutionalized it yet. So it's still reliant. If Trump were to die, the whole thing could fall apart, and I think they know that. And I think that they also realize that it's too soon, that the cult is still too strong. So I think the best thing to do is to set up a fourth uh, uh, aspect of government, which is to implement a king or a monarch or some form of
Wait, best in what sense?
national leader. I mean, best for them, for the Project
Okay.
2025 people, is they set up, like, imagine Trump gets, it's not king, they're not going to call it a king, but it's some thing like a monarch, which is a little bit outside of the government, but responsible for the best interests of the country, and with this, the ability to push and sway and drive parliament, right? Or the yeah, parliament. And then JD Vance or Marco Rubio, like you called out, one of these guys becomes like the prime minister then. And then so Trump is there, but he's not actually in government. He's not the president, but he remains like the figurehead of the country as long as he survives. And then that can be passed down. So that role can also be passed down to whoever else within that orbit.
Well, okay.
But then the beauty is for Trump, right? Now he can do whatever the hell. He has all the power and none of the responsibility. He doesn't have to show up to work. He can just wine and dine, wheel and deal. He can make so much money by doing that, and he has no more responsibilities because he's not actually part of the government anymore. But he runs the government.
I mean, I could envision a situation in which Trump is the head of the MAGA movement and a MAGA loyalist such as Rubio or Vance. I mean, Rubio, questionable how much of a MAGA loyalist he really
Yeah,
is, or
yeah,
just an opportunist. But let's say, for example, Vance comes in and he is tried and true MAGA and he wants to continue everything he loves about Project 2025. Trump is there, but not in explicit power. Trump will die,
yeah,
or right? So
yeah.
do you think it just becomes Trump Jr. of some sort, or
I think that's what they would like to set up. They'd like to set up, uh, they would like to set up a dynasty for Trump, but then separate that from the workings of government, which I think the Project 2025 people know that Trump is an idiot, and he's not really. They actually don't want him around. He just causes trouble, and he can cause better trouble if he's in this different role. Um, so then the Stephen Millers and the Project 2025 people,
Russell
they
Vogt?
can get on. Yeah, they can get on with actually implementing the fascist, not without cult leader, but institutionalized cult leader. They can go ahead and really execute that fascist state that they want. And I think Stephen Miller and Bannon, they actually really do want, like, they're not liberal. They don't want democracy. They
Oh,
actually,
no, I agree. I mean, and there have been some folks on the right who have been explicit about the fact that they want authoritarianism,
yeah,
dictatorship.
yeah,
And I think from the perspective of Bannon, Miller, they view Trump as a useful idiot to a degree.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, Trump has, from my perspective, real concrete ideology. He is just narcissistic and wants flattery, power, and money, and those folks set him up well and used him to execute that. I do think it's difficult to pull that off again. Obviously, the Project 2025 people, Miller, Bannon, Vote, they are looking to spread the infrastructure of MAGA throughout all the branches of government, all the institutions, all the corporations that they can in order to continue that. And then it's a matter of what does the next face of that look like? And it could be someone, it could be freaking Kid Rock for all we
Yeah.
know, or
Yeah.
Nicki
Right.
Minaj, right? It could
Yeah.
be another just charismatic outsider who has a high profile and will execute whatever policy is required as long as they get to get the fame and the money and the power and that. So
I think, yeah, I don't, I'm throwing this out, but like it could be Barron, for example,
sure.
right? Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, he's, because I don't think Trump is going to die between 2028 and 2032, unfortunately. I don't think he's going to die.
Okay, well
So I
that's
think
7 years from now he will be in his mid-80s.
I don't see it. So I think that they have time to build this face of the next generation. And I think if they separate it from running the government versus running MAGA, um, it's easier
Sure.
to find somebody, to find
Right.
those two people. And so long as JD Vance, I agree with you, the marker, but I think both of them are opportunists, by the way. I don't think either of them believe anything that they do, but I think that that's okay. I think the Project 2025 people just need somebody an idiot leader to
Right.
execute through.
I mean, I agree in some sense. I mean, obviously JD Vance called Trump Hitler.
Yeah.
So he is not a Trump true believer and at least expressed some degree of anti-fascist sentiment in that comment, but he took to the MAGA waters real quick after that once he got some
Yep.
power.
Yep.
So okay, so what is the end game here? Are we really, is there a resistance movement that is going to form that can be effective to that? Because that is pretty dire.
Yeah. I think that there is a resistance movement. It won't look like anything that's come before it. I'm not sure what shape it takes. I guess to me, it's sort of like it's now, how long is the dark time? How long are the dark times going to be? Are they going to be one generation? Or are they going to be 5 generations? And I think the resistance will determine that answer, is how effective the resistance is at figuring out a way to do that. But I don't know. And the cross-cutting currents, which we haven't discussed, is AI and the techno fascists, and corporatism. Fascist corporatism is way different in today's world than it was in the
Yeah.
40s.
Yeah. I think that actually brings us to an interesting point because I want to take this a bit more international. So when you get to the corporate aspect of fascism, that is multinational corporations, right? And so they have influence in other nations and, Elon Musk obviously supporting the AFD in Germany and things like that. But those are the things that are obvious. But I would assume that some of this is going on in the background that is less obvious. And there are, there are corporatist underpinnings to Le Pen, to Reform UK, to AFD, to those kinds of parties, to Viktor Orban to continue to support him. As we broaden out, one example I wanted to get into is, what does fascism look like outside of America? How does that interact on the global stage? So if I put that in two different parts, one is Putin and is the Islamic theocracy in Iran, are those two examples of types of fascism being deployed. And if you look at the American attitudes and approaches to those two, how conflicted and how aligned are they? Because it gets very complex at the international level.
I think, the last time I had looked at it, those two examples, that Iran and Russia, I think that they check the needed boxes of fascism to say that both of those regimes are at this pace, at least similar to the US early fascist. But again, the way that you do it with the book is sit down with the dimensions, go gather evidence online about those countries. And we don't have time to do that today, but that would be the process. And I think what you will find is that when you will gather sufficient evidence across the 12 dimensions to say, yeah, that those are both examples of fascism. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. It's hard for me not to see that this is all going to sort of divide the world into three. There's going to be China can have Asia, Russia can have the Europe, and the US will have
The
the
Western Hemisphere.
Americas. And then Africa will be split up for, Africa will be split up for resources and, if needed, be proxy war territory.
Well, what about the Middle East?
Sorry, that would go to Putin.
Yeah, I don't see that. No, I don't see that at all. But I do think
Because that China and the US can't afford to give up the oil that's there, or because of the power and strength of the Muslim resistance, or why can't you see that?
I think it's a combination of those and other factors. I don't see the states in the Middle East, from Israel to Saudi Arabia to Iran to Qatar, bending the knee to Putin. I just don't see it. And you're talking about some very large armed forces and the economic gravity of the Middle East is greater than that of Russia. So I don't see that. I don't know.
So
I
you
see a little bit more of a cyberpunk scenario where there are corporate fascist entities that
mm,
are the power of the nation states in general enough that some of those questions don't actually matter in terms of spheres of influence, but I think that might be something for another day. That goes back to some of the points you were making earlier. All right, well, that was very cheery. I think on that note, I think it's time to wrap up unless you have any final thoughts that you want to communicate here.
no, I the only thing I would communicate is I don't think it's cheery. I think I think if you look up and you really look around, we're in a bad situation now. And it doesn't, to me, it doesn't really look like it's going to get any better. But that doesn't mean that everything is the end of history. Fascist regimes, even if they could be institutionalized, it's hard to imagine that they can last forever. They will fall apart at some point in time because central control has shown itself to be fragile, and so those things will decay and fall apart. And that's why I say what really matters about the resistance and why resistance is so important is I think how the effectiveness of the resistance defines whether or not this is going to be one generation of Handmaid's Tale or 5 generations of Handmaid's Tale. But beyond five, I just think it'll fall apart. So it's bound. There is going to be a return of democratic values, but it could be a really freaking long time with a lot of suffering in between. And I think that defines why the resistance is important. Resistance is not going to stop the flow of history. I think, I'm sorry to say, for me, we're in early stage fascism and we will get to full blown fascism. That's where it's all going. But that doesn't mean that. So the resistance isn't about stopping that from happening. The resistance is about tampering that, reducing the time that fascist value system can stay, and doing their best to protect people that don't have power during that period, right? So there will be all of the people who are outed by the hegemony, and rather than going to concentration camps, maybe we can help them find somewhere else in the world to live. Maybe, I don't know what that is, but there are ways, right? There are ways to open our doors to the people that are going to be most hurt by the next period. And I think That's why the resistance is so important.
Very interesting point of view. I guess I don't mean to keep this going. I do think fascism in this era will look and does look different than it did in the 40s. And I think that there are lessons about maintaining authoritarian power, and there's infrastructure for maintaining authoritarian power. If we look at some place like China, the effectiveness of using technology for surveillance and control and suppression of dissent is something on a scale that just obviously didn't exist during the 90s. And then if we look at, I'm going to make you uncomfortable here, we look at a more benign authoritarian or autocratic system
We
such as
are
the one in
Singapore,
such as Singapore.
Singaporean.
So Singapore has maintained essentially a one-party system to varying degrees of authoritarianism and autocracy for a couple of generations now, and it doesn't seem like it's eroding anytime soon, as far as I can tell. So there's an interesting model there that is, you talked about the fragility of authoritarian systems, and part of
Although
that is the lack
I
of
would
feedback.
I would say that Singapore is more like autocratic dictatorship. It doesn't make the jump into authoritarianism.
No, I agree. I agree. But yeah, the autocratic
Yeah.
system, and there's more of this detail in
But
the book. But
what
yeah,
you were going to say is that, yeah, Singapore has done a very, in my opinion, Singapore has done a very, very good job of listening, pivoting, and staying relevant. And it's amazing to see the social change that has occurred. And I've only been here, I don't know, 30 years or whatever. That's not a long time. And they went from very locked down to very open today, or in comparison. I don't think that they're San Francisco or anything, but you know, they've really, they're amazing, and that's a great example of a benign dictatorship that has lasted multiple generations and seems at the moment to be able to continue to go forward. They are as a nation, a
a city
city
state.
state, so it's a little bit easier to manage than a giant, you know, United States or Europe. It's just a tiny little place, so long as the economy goes well, they actually can make life pretty nice for everybody. Um,
I guess what's interesting to me is you made the very important distinction between autocracy and authoritarianism or fascism, which is ideological. To me, Singapore ultimately is all about pragmatism and not about ideology,
yes,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So there's the nickname Singapore Inc. because ultimately it's kind of run as a business for the benefit of its shareholders, its citizens, and it's very effective at that. And like you say, at a small scale, that can work. So perhaps the ideological component of authoritarian and fascist states is that weakness because
mm,
you are not open to feedback. There is no dissent. You cannot disagree because it's not about facts or evidence, it's about ideology. I think in Singapore, or let's say an enlightened monarch of another era, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, I don't know.
yeah,
The example doesn't matter, but they would take in information and act on it in a reasonable and pragmatic way. Whereas I think if you're trapped within the prism of an ideology, whether it's the Soviet ideology or a fascist ideology or a Christian nationalist ideology, it's very difficult to integrate evidence and facts and form adjustments to policy and actions on that basis.
yeah.
And that
And
might be the weakness.
the other thing I wanted to add about that, which I was just thinking about recently with the evangelicals, is that what happens is because you can't question ideology, you lose your skill at questioning outside of the context of ideology too. So you just, maybe that I'm not allowed to so the fact that they are evangelical Christian means that they're not going to question the Bible and God, right? And then and because of that, they lose their ability to question because they're like, they're not practicing that skill. So then it comes to internet hoaxes or propaganda or whatever, anything else, science, flat earth. They've lost their ability to question
Critical
anything.
think.
They can't critical think. They can't critical. They just lost the ability.
Well, we
So,
could go on for a long time about religion, and that might be a subject for a different podcast, because I do agree that religious fundamentalism in general is antithetical to democratic liberal values. And yeah, and part of that is because you cannot think critically about something that is dogmatic, and that limits your ability to do anything effectively beyond that scope. But I find it interesting to pull even farther back in a historical context. Nation states are relatively recent in human
mm,
history. Most of human existence has been, the powerful control everything, and they do whatever they want. Might makes right has been the case for a very long time, relatively, and a relatively tiny window of anything considering liberal democratic values. And even if we go back, one thing fascism did is it hearkened to pre-Christian ethics in terms of the Roman Empire, in terms of, the Vikings, that kind of thought, which is again that valorization of might and power, that will to power, if you want to take it in the Nietzschean sense. Um, and it's possible, on the one hand, that liberal democracy is just an aberration, and that the long arc of history has been might makes right, and we're back to regularly scheduled programming on that front. But it's also possible that there is, once that once that genie is out of the bottle and people understand that it's a possibility, that they will strive for more. And it's ironic to me that the founding fathers of America were deists, so they were informed by explicitly Christian values, although not Christian dogma or Christian practice religiously. But there's a great book by one of the guys who has the Rest is History podcast, which basically argues that all Western values are Christian or Judeo-Christian values. And the idea of protecting the weak, the idea of, communal cooperation beyond something like warfare, um, all of those values are essentially Judeo-Christian values, which unfortunately kind of support some of the fascist talking points. But then again, that Christian nationalist concept of Christianity is so out of whack to anything you read from Jesus's teaching in the New Testament that it's unrecognizable. But that civilizational war, to some degree, is arbitrary, right? We can there is no objective inherent value unless you look at an ethical perspective from the ground up of utilitarianism to different forms of government, right? So the greatest lifting up of a population happened in, right? So
yes.
lifting that many people out of poverty is the greatest achievement that has occurred on an economic scale. I would argue that occurred once they got rid of communism as an economic policy and embraced capitalism under Deng Xiaoping. But regardless, on the political side, they never ceased to be authoritarian, right?
Right.
And so there is a sense to which values and forms of governance are relative. And what are you trying to achieve? And what is your basis for that? So if you look at the Iranian theocracy, for them, that fits their value system, which is why in our book we had to baseline at the assumptions that, okay, the liberal democratic values of the American experiment are worth preserving. But there's a wider discussion is,
Yeah.
are they?
Yeah. Exactly.
And that is the civilizational discussion that's taking place. I happen to agree in principle with liberal democratic values, and you can say that's because I was brought up that way, but I enjoy the freedom of expression. I enjoy I enjoy those values, and I think they're worth fighting for. And like you say, the resistance is about that. You choose your battles, you choose what values are important to you, and then you take action on the back of that.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. If there was going to be a next round of democracy, I think that you could keep all of the founder stuff, which is the separation of power and the ability to control power, the ability to control the natural human's desire to create centralized
Accumulate
power and
power. Yeah.
to use it for negative. We just have to add greed. We didn't put the checks and balances on the economic system. That was the mistake. And for the next round of democracy, I think they need to put checks and balances on greed, and maybe that solves the problem, or that at least gets us to, level 2 of democracy.
I do think part of that is that the folks who instigated the American Revolution were the landed aristocracy.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So they didn't want a king, but they definitely didn't mind having the rich people in power. And really, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, those evolved out of, and the Ken Burns documentary on the American Revolution is brilliant in this regard. That actually evolved out of integrating different segments of society into the resistance against the British. And once those other different racial and religious and ethnic groups, once those were integrated into the American Revolution, that those concepts were integrated into the American experiment at a theoretical level as illustrated in the documents forming what America was about, the Federalist Papers. And so you had the landed aristocracy, these very educated and very Enlightenment era thinkers, but then they kind of ran up against, well, if it's really freedom, it's really freedom. And they gave it a shot. But they were still the landed aristocracy. And I tend to think that you're probably right that AI is going to be involved in that next level of governmental experiment. And that's where things are going to get interesting. Distributed autonomous organizations, AI, and the level of personal empowerment that goes beyond the traditional sense of greed and power. All right, we have kept our listeners for a very long time. I do want to promise that while we will probably, we'll touch on a range of topics, we probably won't be consistently this political on this show.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, the next episode we're planning, and it will be released either before or after this one, we'll see how it goes, is on another book that we worked on together, but you wrote on working backwards. So we're, again, Slashcast, it's work/life/balance, and the slashes are where the interesting stuff happens, how those areas overlap. And next time we're going to talk a lot about work. And as always, please like, subscribe, give feedback, and we hope you keep joining and listening in, and we'll keep doing this. So thanks, Eric, and I will talk to you very soon.
The resistance does matter. Goodbye.
Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. Viva la revolution. We'll do all of them. Okay.